Hi everyone, and welcome back to another Voiceflow tutorial video. Today we are going to be learning about the intent block, which allows you to create nonlinear, engaging conversations with your users. Then we're going to show you the difference between the intent block and the choice block, since they both use intents. And finally, we'll put the intent block into action by demonstrating how to use them in your project. If you haven't already learned about intents, I recommend you watch part 1 of our choice block tutorial, which explains intents and how they work. In this video, we will show you how the intent block uses intents to allow you to jump between different parts of your conversation without having to link lines between blocks. Again, this allows you to create more natural, nonlinear conversations, very much like how a human would normally speak. So for this example, we are on the Voiceflow canvas here, and you can see we have a project called Storybook. Now in Storybook, we have a basic speak block or step where we are saying, welcome back to Storybook, would you like to hear a story? We then have a choice step, and if the user says no, then we're going to say, no problem, goodbye, and we'll end the skill. If they say yes, we're going to go, great, what chapter would you like? From there, we have an open-ended choice step, meaning that in this choice step, we don't have any other paths available other than the else path. You see, I can create paths, but I'm going to go ahead and delete these again. And what this does is this will have Alexa or Google simply sit there and listen, and they're going to listen for what the user is going to say next. And so in this case, we have 3 different chapters that the user could jump to. They could go to chapter 1, chapter 2, or chapter 3. And each of these has an intent step in it. And so we're going to go over how this works and how this allows you to create this nonlinear conversation that, as you can see, doesn't have any lines, and so it allows you to jump to different parts of the conversation in your project. Now you might have noticed that I've referred to intent and choice blocks as steps, and this is really how we should be thinking about our blocks moving forward when they're being housed within a combined block, as steps within a group of interactions or turns. Now you might be asking yourself, what does he mean by turns? Well, we can think of a conversation like a series of turns between each person speaking, or in the case of building voice apps, the user and the assistant. Each of these turns can be made up of a series of steps. This is why Voiceflow has organized our blocks into steps, so that we can bundle together steps of functionality that make up each user's conversational turn. This is also a great way to reinforce conversational design best practice in your workflow. Now let's go over the difference between the choice block and the intent block. So I'm going to pull both blocks onto our canvas here, and you'll see that they both use intents. And so for example, if we go into our choice block, you can see we can choose one of our existing intents, and that is the same with our intent block. They're both running off existing or new intents that we create. However, the difference is the intent block cannot be linked to. So for example, with the choice block here, you'll see that we actually cannot link to the intent block. But if we were to have another choice block, so I'll pull this out, you can see that we can actually link 2 choice blocks. And this allows you to create these linear conversations that move in one direction. And this is the big difference between a choice block and an intent block. The choice block has these paths where you can add multiple different intents. So I delete this one, and in path 1, we might have our chapter 1 intent. Maybe in path 2, we will have our chapter 2 intent. And now if the user says anything, it's going to look for either chapter 1, chapter 2, or else. And so it allows you to create these linear conversations that are going to walk the user through a predefined path where they have predefined choices. With the intent block, however, because there is only one port or path coming out, it allows you to essentially jump between conversations. So let's actually show you how this works in practice. So first I'm going to delete these. And we're going to go up into our prototype tab. And then we'll hit Start Test.
Welcome back to Storybook. Would you like to hear a story?
And so this is just a basic choice step. So we can either say yes or no. So I'm going to say yes.
Great. What chapter would you like?
And now you'll see we have this open-ended choice step here with only an else path available. So what we can actually do is we can go ahead and say 3 and activate our chapter 3 intent.
This is chapter 3.
And you'll see we jumped all the way over here to chapter 3, and we did so without a direct link to this combine block. After that occurs, we again have another open-ended choice step, and so let's go ahead and say 2 for chapter 2.
This is chapter 2.
Now let's try saying 1 for chapter 1.
This is chapter 1.
And then let's go back to chapter 3 by typing 3.
This is chapter 3.
And so you can see this works very differently than a choice step despite them both using intents. It allows for this open-ended conversation where everything is divided up into sections. And of course, you could actually pair this with a choice step if you wanted to. So for example, if in our chapter 2, we wanted to go, so let's go back to the canvas here. So in our chapter 2, we can actually go ahead and add paths at the end. And then from here, we could go on and continue to create a linear conversation. So that is something we could do if we wanted to. And that's where the flexibility of the intent block or step comes in. It allows you to jump around your conversation from different sections. So maybe you wanted to allow your user to go back to the beginning. Maybe you want them to skip to the end. Or maybe you have a particular section that you want to be able to jump right in the middle. These are all things you can do with the intent block or step. And then if you so choose, you can go right back into a more linear conversation afterwards. So having both the choice block and the intent block at your disposal gives you a great deal of flexibility when creating different kinds of conversations. So now let's go ahead and learn how we can actually create an intent and then go ahead and use the intent step to be able to jump to a different part of our conversation. So I'm going to go over to the end here, and we're going to create a chapter 4 for our fictitious storybook. So what I'm going to do is pull out the intent block, drop this onto our canvas, and from here we're going to want to create a new intent for chapter 4. So I'm going to call this chapter 4, and I'm going to create that intent, and I also need to add a couple of utterances in here, so I'm going to say chapter 4, and then I'll just say 4. Great. So now we have our chapter 4 intent step, and we want to go ahead and just say something like, this is chapter 4 in our speak step, so we'll type that in here. And then we want to add an open-ended choice step so that the conversation doesn't end, and Alexa and Google will instead listen for our next command. Great. So now I'm going to color this blue just to keep with my theme here, and we'll rename this to chapter 4. Awesome. Now let's go ahead into our prototype tab, and we'll see how this works. So we'll go over and hit Start Test.
Welcome back to Storybook. Would you like to hear a story?
And we'll type yes.
Great. What chapter would you like?
So now let's try 4.
This is chapter 4.
Great. So now let's go back to chapter 1.
This is chapter 1.
Fantastic. So we can now see that our intent step is working. Alexa is listening for these global intents, which are all of the different chapter intents that we've created. Now, if we wanted to, from here we could continue building out our conversation rather than ending with an else path. We could create a branching network of blocks and steps, add audio files. The possibilities are endless. The main point to take away here, though, is that the user, with the help of the intent block or step, is now able to skip to different chapters within their conversation. This adds a ton of flexibility so that we don't have to force the user through a linear conversation. So now we have learned about the intent block or step. And just as a quick summary of what we learned today, the intent step cannot be linked into, and it must be the first part of a combined block. So you can see here, I cannot have it as a later step. It always has to be the first part of the conversation flow. It's also important to remember that intent steps are different than choice steps because they are free floating. They do not have anything linking into them, and they only have one potential port or link out of them. There are no paths like you would see in a choice step, so as an example, if I go into a choice step, you'll see it has multiple different paths, and depending on what the user says, it will branch off into different directions. The intent step, on the other hand, will only go in one direction. However, it is listening constantly for its particular intent to be said. And this allows you to create these nonlinear conversations where you can jump or skip to different sections within your project. So this is very, very useful, but different than the choice step. It's also important to remember that blocks and steps are fundamentally the same thing, and that referring to blocks as steps, especially when grouped together in a combined block, is a great way to think about the different interactions taking place within a conversation. And that's it. I hope this video helped you understand intent steps and how they work. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope to see you in the next video.